Hello, everybody. We are from the Green Bay campus, and today we are talking about client abandonment. And this is Robin, Lindsay, and Michelle speaking.
Just an outline of what we'll be covering. First, we'll be describing client abandonment as a legal and ethical issue and who is affected by client abandonment, associated legal issues, associated ethical dilemmas, how legal and ethical dimensions interact, a model of decision making that can be directly applied to client abandonment, strategies that may be already implemented in responding or intervening both legally and ethically to client abandonment, and new approaches that might be used with rationale for action, and summary of next possible steps to take.
As a brief overview of client abandonment occurs primarily when a healthcare professional who is responsible for the client refuses to provide care or neglects to follow through with his or her duties without making necessary arrangements for the continuation of care for that client. Examples of client abandonment include failing to find or wait for coverage when stepping away from the unit or at the end of one's shift, termination of a working relationship without notice, excuse, or provisions for replacement of care, failing to relay essential information to a provider, and failing to report suspicions of abuse, among others. In order for a situation to be considered abandonment, the healthcare professional must both consent to the relationship and accept the assignment, and then end up severing the relationship or ending the assignment without notice to the appropriate person. Individuals that may be affected by client abandonment include the client, as they are the individual who was abandoned. This can either cause physical, mental, or emotional damage, as well as undue pain and suffering. Other individuals affected by client abandonment include the healthcare professional who failed to perform their duties in the continuity of care. Associated legal issues include negligence, or the failure to exercise care, thus resulting in unintentional physical harm. And a violation of this would be a healthcare professional who abandons their client, directly neglects their care, and increases the likelihood for physical or emotional harm. Malpractice, which is a breach of duty or violation of standards of care, thus resulting in physical harm, is a violation that a healthcare professional who abandons their client violates their duty in upholding their assignment and places that client at risk for physical harm. If an injury is sustained as a result of client abandonment, the healthcare organization may be sued for damages. Additionally, the State Board of Nursing can investigate and discipline in cases where abandonment may have occurred. Associated ethical dilemmas include beneficence, or the duty to provide high quality care, and this is a violation as a healthcare professional who abandons their client fails to provide care to the best of their abilities. Non-maleficence, or the duty to do no harm, is a violation when a healthcare professional who abandons their client subjects them to adverse health outcomes. In addition, fidelity, or the duty to remain faithful, is a violation as a healthcare professional who abandons their client demonstrates unfaithfulness to them. And last of all, justice, or the duty to provide fair and equal treatment to all clients, is a violation as a healthcare professional who abandons their client fails to provide just care to each client under their direct care. So how legal and ethical dimensions interact with one another. Nurses who accept assignments while they are aware that they lack competency or that tasks within that assignment are outside of their scope of practice knowingly put their patients at risk and therefore have failed to ethically and legally care for their client.
Plus ethical decision-making model. Plus stands for policies, legal, universal, and self. Things that should be considered when one is making ethical decisions. Policies should be considered to make sure the decision is congruent with policies. Legal policies should also be considered. Universal stands for professional and facility values that should be considered, and self should also be considered to make sure the decision is in agreement with the person's beliefs. The first step is to decide why the decision must be made and what will the desired result be. The problem should be stated as the desired outcome. Step 2 is to seek out resources such as evidence-based research, ethics committees, or mentors that will help think of alternatives and solutions to the problem. Step 3 encourages the decision maker to think outside the box and try to identify different solutions to the problem. It is recommended to have at least 5 alternatives in order to understand all sides of the issue. The next step is to evaluate the alternatives, which involves listing positive and negative aspects of each alternative, reflecting on the outcome of each alternative. The decision maker should be aware that there is rarely one perfect alternative that will solve the problem. Step 5 is making the decision by selecting the best alternative identified in Step 4. Step 6 is taking action and implementing the decision. Step 7 is to evaluate if the decision fixed the problem and ask, is the problem better or worse? And finally, in Step 7, you'll ask if it created new problems and find a way to improve on the decision that was made. Applying the plus ethical decision-making model. An example would be to identify the problem. The problem may be nurses leaving facility before they have sufficient nursing coverage at the end of shift. Support and guidance that the nurse could seek out, or the nurse manager, is evidence-based articles, consult with other unit managers about the problem, or seek out ethics committee or upper management's advice. Alternative options to resolve this problem might be to educate an educational program on client abandonment for nurses, mandating notification of supervisor or charge nurse by nurses who are leaving and coming on shift before anyone leaves, identification of nurses who leave early and investigating why the staff is leaving early, or modification of nursing schedules so there is an overlap to avoid any time where there is no nurse for a client. Then you would evaluate these alternatives and consider all the ones that were mentioned above. Education would be cheap, but it may not be effective. Changing the schedule so there is an overlap between nurses arriving and leaving would work, but then the facility would have to pay twice as many nurses for the period of time that there are 2 nurses instead of 1. If nurses are leaving earlier, if the reason for the nurses leaving earlier is identified that they need to pick up their children, management could offer resources to the nurses, such as child care or after school programs, so that nurses wouldn't have to leave early to get their children. The decision that I believe would be the best is to educate the nurses so they understand that what they are doing is considered client abandonment via a mandatory nurse in service, and then mandate nurses notify the charge nurse before they leave the unit and when arriving on shift. And then action and evaluation would have to be done after the decision is implemented.
So there are some strategies already in place to address this issue. One of these strategies is the Patient Safety and Quality Improvement Act. This addresses safe levels of staffing and limits mandatory overtime. When nurses are being forced to work mandatory overtime shifts, they are more prone to errors and mistakes. So really that shouldn't be happening as often as it does. There are also federal and state conscientious objection statuses, which allow for the refusal of care based off of moral, ethical, and legal obligations or objections. There are collective bargaining agreements, which state that there are specific nurse-to-patient ratios that must be met. And then there's the RN Safe Staffing Act, which addresses understaffing and unsafe patient assignments. So some ideas for new approaches to address this situation are listed here. We came up with a few. One would be a designated float pool. This ensures that no one is involuntarily forced to float to other units. Not everyone feels comfortable doing that, so they shouldn't be forced to. Float nurses typically enjoy or have had experience working in a variety of different units, and they sign up to work in that position, so they should be fine floating other units. Another idea would be to include rotation in other units as part of the training process for new nurses. This ensures that all nurses have had at least some exposure to the various units and helps to alleviate fears of working on a completely new unit. Obviously, this would be taking time and money to train the nurses, but I think it would be well worth it in the long run. Another idea would be a volunteer sign up for floating positions if there is no designated float pool. Some nurses have many more years of experience working in various departments and would be more comfortable floating. This allows for those people to do so over the people who may not be comfortable accepting floating assignments. And then, as mentioned previously, scheduling overlaps could be addressed. Having at least one extra person scheduled to overlap part of both the morning and night shift can avoid gaps in the coverage. So these are just a couple ideas that we came up with for new approaches. So the next steps regarding client abandonment. If a healthcare professional accepts an assignment they later realize they aren't equipped to handle, they should make their supervisor aware, be objective and professional, ask for help, and document clearly. So if this happens to you, you should make sure you follow this advice. It's going to prevent you from getting into any situations you don't feel comfortable with and anything that could be considered client abandonment. If the concern is not met with an appropriate response by the charge nurse, or if the situation continues to occur on a regular basis, a great next step would be to meet with the unit manager or even higher up leaders to discuss the situation. If it's not resolved, continue seeking higher levels of management until someone listens. If the issue is still not resolved despite these multiple efforts to work with management, it might just be best to resign from the position or transfer, because it is your license that would suffer, so you need to make sure you're protecting it.